the Hudson Library and Historical Society presents a look back at one of America's favorite book series. The Little House book series, written by renowned author Laura Ingalls Wilder, featuring an annotated autobiography of the author, Pioneer Girl, with the book's editor and Ingalls Wilder expert Pamela Smith-Hill. Recorded at the Hudson Library's Flood Meeting Room on April 4th, 2016.
Good evening and welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society. I'm so pleased to see such a great audience for tonight. Thank you for braving the weather. Maybe someday I won't have to thank everyone for braving the weather. Before we get started, I just want to talk about a few programs coming up, in case you didn't know about them. On this Thursday, Mary Norris, she is the best-selling author of Between You and Me, Confessions of a Comma Queen. She is a copy editor at the New Yorker magazine. She's been a copy editor for over 30 years. And if you know anything about the New Yorker, you know that they have very strict standards about punctuation and grammar and spelling. So she's seen every grammatical mistake that can possibly be made. And she wrote a humorous book about it. And I think it's going to be a really fun talk. She'll talk about all those fun things in our English language that are, interesting and different, and maybe you'll learn something too. So that's this Thursday, same place, 7 p.m. Next week is National Library Week. We have a whole lineup of programs, so check that out. Of special interest, Wednesday, from 4 to 8 p.m., Cowan's Auctions. If any of you have ever watched Antiques Roadshow, you may have seen Wes Cowan. He'll be here. You bring in your antique that you have dusted off, bring it in, they'll appraise it for you for free. That's happening from 4 to 8 p.m., a limit of 2 items per person. And then finally on April 14th, we're going to have the authors of a book called The Smartest Places on Earth, Why Rust Belts Are the Emerging Hotspots of Global Innovation, and they were just on the Diane Reeves show this morning, so if you caught that, they will be here next week. So I hope you can join us for all these great programs. I'm really pleased to introduce Pamela Smith-Hill. She's the award-winning author of Laura Ingalls Wilder, A Writer's Life, and 3 young adult novels. She grew up in the Missouri Ozarks, 40 miles from Laura Ingalls Wilder's Rocky Ridge farm, and moved to South Dakota, where she launched her professional writing career. She has taught creative and professional writing at universities in Oregon, Washington, and Colorado. She now lives in Portland, where she continues to teach and write. So I hope you enjoy, and please welcome Pamela Smith.
If I didn't have to go home to Portland tomorrow, I would stick around for Thursday's presentation. I've heard her on NPR, and my goodness, I really wish I could stay around and see her. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. I appreciate you braving the cold. It seems really cold to me. When I left Portland, it was 70 degrees. And I just looked at the extended forecast, and not to make you pea green with envy, but it's going to be 84 on Thursday there. I'm ready to go home and get in my garden. Thank you again for coming tonight. In the summer of 2014, the Associated Press and Publishers Weekly broke the news that Pioneer Girl, Laura Ingalls Wilder's previously unpublished autobiography, was soon to be published. According to the Associated Press, the book was a more realistic, grittier view of frontier living. Associated Press reporter Kevin Burbach went on to say that the book included not safe for children tales and stark scenes of domestic abuse, love triangles gone awry, and a man who lit himself on fire while drunk on whiskey. News outlets from the United States and beyond, from the New York Times to National Public Radio, from the Christian Science Monitor to The Guardian in the UK, picked up the story. And by the time the book was published in November 2014, reporters and most reviewers alike continued to focus on the dark side of Wilder's world. The headline in the Wall Street Journal, a grim house on the prairie. Now, was I surprised by the media spin on Pioneer Girl? All this frenzy about the dark, disturbing scenes depicted in the autobiography? Well, frankly, yes. Because from my perspective anyway, there's so much more to Pioneer Girl than what the Associated Press reporter described as those not safe for children tales. In fact, I'd spent several hours talking to that reporter about so much more in the manuscript than grit and scandal. Why had he zeroed in on that aspect of Pioneer Girl? It was a relatively small part of my interview with him. The obvious answer, of course, is that popular culture thrives on grit and scandal. I shouldn't have been surprised. But beyond that, there was an implication that Wilder had whitewashed her life in the Little House books, that she had covered up the truth when she transitioned from the nonfiction of Pioneer Girl to the fiction of the Little House books. One reviewer from my own hometown called this a glaring distortion. Certainly Wilder made significant changes when she shifted from writing nonfiction to fiction. More about this in a minute. But I came to realize, as more stories and reviews about Pioneer Girl were featured in the national and international press, that much of the media's obsession over Wilder's dark side was related not to the Little House novels themselves, but to the television series. What you're seeing here is the front page of a French language newspaper published in Switzerland in December 2014, and a rough translation of the text is The True History of Laura and the Little House on the Prairie. But notice the photograph is of Melissa Gilbert, the actress who played Laura in the TV series, not the real Laura Ingalls. Now, to be fair, the newspaper does feature historical photos of Laura, but the image of Melissa Gilbert appeared on the front page to heighten the contrast between the realities of Pioneer Girl and the fiction of Little House on the Prairie. And images of the TV series or references to it surfaced again and again when reporters and reviewers contrasted Wilder's real-world experiences in Pioneer Girl with the fictional ones. Now, why is this significant? Does it matter that reporters and reviewers were focused on the television series versus Wilder's books when drawing comparisons to Pioneer Girl? First, a few words about the TV series. The television series Little House on the Prairie ran on NBC from 1974 until 1982, and it's still in syndication today. It won Emmys for its cinematography and music, and TV Guide named one of the show's episodes to its list of 100 great episodes of all times. The show was incredibly successful and very popular, but it is a highly reimagined interpretation of Wilder's original books. For one thing, there's the cast itself. In case you can't tell, the real Charles Ingalls is on the right. In general, the TV characters are softer, more sentimental, less rough around the edges, less gritty than the fictional characters in the Little House books. More about this in a minute, too. Even the setting is radically different. The TV family settles in Walnut Grove, yet Wilder wrote just one book, On the Banks of Plum Creek, about the fictional family's experiences there. Both the real Ingalls family and the fictional ones from the book moved to Dakota Territory, and Wilder set 5 of her 9 books there. In fact, 4 of these 5 books, By the Shores of Silver Lake, The Long Winter, Little Town on the Prairie, and These Happy Golden Years, were finalists for the coveted Newbery Award in children's literature. They are often considered Wilder's strongest book, and yet the setting for these books, along with many of their most memorable scenes and episodes, weren't part of the television series. And the TV show took lots of liberties with the characters and episodes from the books that they did include. Here's just one example. In real life, in Wilder's fiction and in the TV series, Mary Ingalls lost her sight. And in fact, the real Ingalls family sent Mary to the College of the Blind in Vinton, Iowa. She graduated from there in 1889. But unlike her television counterpart portrayed by Melissa Sue Anderson, the real Mary Ingalls and the fictional character in the books never married. She lived out her life in South Dakota in the house Charles Ingalls built for his family there. The TV series gave Mary a happy, more rosy future. She falls in love and gets married. In general, the TV show casts a happier, rosier, and more conventional glow over Wilder's entire cast of characters. Now, the TV series has become iconic in its own right, and in many ways appears to have overshadowed Wilder's books. When reporters and reviewers observe that Wilder's autobiography contrasts with the bright, sunny optimism of the Little House series, I suspect they're unconsciously referring to the TV show. They may not be aware of scenes like this from Wilder's books. In On the Banks of Plum Creek, Laura is nearly drowned when she tries to cross the flooded creek. The scene, however, isn't simply about danger or disobedience. As you'll see in a minute, Laura doesn't learn from this incident that she should simply obey her mother. Instead, she learns something darker, more subtle, and even more sophisticated. I want to take a look at this scene more closely. Now, initially in the scene, the creek seems to laugh and call to Laura. It beckons her to come play. So she clasps her hands on a plank and she rolls onto it. In that very instant, she knew the creek was not playing. It was strong and terrible. It seized her whole body and pulled it under the plank. Only her head was out and one arm desperately across the plank. The water was pulling her and pushing too. It was trying to drag her head under the plank. Her chin held onto the edge and her arm clutched while the water pulled hard to the rest of her. It was not laughing now. No one knew where she was. No one could hear her if she screamed for help. The water roared loud and tugged at her stronger and stronger. Laura kicked, but the water was stronger than her legs. She got both arms across the plank and pulled, but the water pulled harder. It pulled the back of her head down and it jerked as if it would jerk her in two. It was cold. The coldness soaked into her. This was not like wolves or cattle. The creek was not alive. It was only strong and terrible and never stopping. It would pull her down and whirl her away, rolling and tossing her like a willow branch. It would not care. Notice the line here, it would not care. The natural world is ambivalent. It doesn't care about Laura or any human endeavor. Nature isn't simply warm and sunny and beautiful in Wilder's books. It can be dangerous and deadly. How does the scene end? Laura escapes, and Ma hopes the incident will teach Laura a lesson. She says, "Well, Laura, you have been very naughty, and I think you knew it all the time. But I can't punish you. I can't even scold you. You came near being drowned." Now, if the scene had ended here with the expected moral lesson, obey your parents, it would have been more conventional, perhaps the kind of episode many reporters and reviewers assume fill the pages of Wilder's Little House books. But this isn't where the scene ends. Laura did not say anything. The creek would go down. It would be a gentle, pleasant place to play in again. But nobody could make it do that. Nobody could make it do anything. Laura knew now that there were things stronger than anybody. But the creek had not got her. It had not made her scream, and it could not make her cry. Laura is a very tough and unyielding little girl. She's unrepentant. She has grit in a world that is sometimes dark and ambivalent. I want to share with you another scene from yet another Little House book that speaks to the seamier side of life, another scene that might surprise reporters and reviewers who think Wilder's books are consistently sunny and bright. This one is from Little Town on the Prairie. It's set in DeSmet, Dakota Territory, when Laura, as a teenager, is working in town. She hopes her wages will help pay for Mary's college expenses. She is making buttonholes for Mrs. White, who lives and works in her son-in-law's store, and the book, his name is Mr. Clancy. When the big man had gone on, Mr. Clancy asked Mrs. White when his shirts would be done. Mrs. White said she did not know which shirts they were, and then Mr. Clancy swore. Laura scrooged small in her chair, basting as fast as she could. Mr. Clancy snatched shirts from the pile and almost threw them at Mrs. White. Still shouting and swearing, he said she'd get them done before dinner or he'd know the reason why. "I'll not be driven and hounded," Mrs. White blazed, "not by you nor any other shanty Irishman." Laura hardly heard what Mr. Clancy said then. She wanted desperately to be somewhere else. But Mrs. White told her to come along to dinner. They went into the kitchen behind the stove, behind the store, and Mr. Clancy came raging after them. Lunchtime, however, provides no relief. The kitchen was hot and crowded and cluttered. Mrs. Clancy was putting dinner on the table, and 3 little girls and a boy were pushing each other off their chairs. Mr. and Mrs. Clancy and Mrs. White, all quarreling at the top of their voices, sat down and ate heartily. Laura could not even understand what they were quarreling about. They seemed so angry that she was afraid they would strike each other. Now, there's an element of dark humor here, but clearly this is a dysfunctional family. How does Laura respond? She continues to work through the day. It's her first day on the job, in fact, with Mrs. White. The hours are long, her shoulders and her neck ache. Her fingers ache too from working the needle, hour after hour. But she does the work without complaint. And when Pa comes to walk her home after sunset, he asks, "How did you like your first day of working for pay, Half Pint? You make out all right?" "I think so," she answered. "Mrs. White spoke well of my buttonholes." She doesn't breathe a word to Pa or to anyone else in the family about how uncomfortable, extraordinarily uncomfortable she is at working for Mrs. White. She only thinks about the money she can earn for Mary's college. Laura is a tough little girl and on the banks of Plum Creek. She's a tough young woman in Little Town on the Prairie. The Clancy White household, of course, isn't the only dysfunctional family Wilder depicts in her Little House books. There's the Brewster family in these happy golden years. I can see some of you nodding and smiling. And there's this mythic scene in the book, Mrs. Brewster and the butcher knife. In this scene, Laura's teaching school for the first time and boarding with Mr. and Mrs. Brewster in an isolated claim shanty 12 miles from home. Laura is just 15. Laura sat straight up. Moonlight was streaming over her bed from the window. Mrs. Brewster screamed again, a wild sound without words that made Laura's scalp crinkle. "Take the knife back to the kitchen," Mr. Brewster said. Laura peeped through the cracks between the curtains. The moonlight shone through the calico and thinned the darkness so that Laura saw Mrs. Brewster standing there. Her long white flannel nightgown trailed on the floor, and her black hair fell loose over her shoulders. In her upraised hand, she held the butcher knife. Ultimately, Mr. Brewster convinces his wife to put the knife away, but Laura spends a sleepless night on the slippery couch behind the curtains, just a few feet away from the Brewsters. And in the end, she reaches this conclusion. She knew she must not be afraid. Pa had always said she must never be afraid. Very likely, nothing would happen. She was not exactly afraid of Mrs. Brewster. for she knew she was quick and strong as a little French horse. That is, when she was awake. But she had never wanted so much to go home. Yet Laura finishes out the term, and she tells her family nothing about that butcher knife. Now, this scene may seem very tame by today's standards in young adult literature, but in the early 1940s, Wilder's depiction of Mrs. Brewster and the butcher knife was both daring and edgy. After she submitted the manuscript to her publisher, her literary agent wrote, "Mrs. Nordstrom is suggesting that Mrs. Brewster's butcher knife incident be cut out." Ursula Nordstrom was Wilder's editor at Harper & Brothers, her publisher, and Ursula Nordstrom went on to become a literary figure in her own right. She edited the work of E.B. White, author of Charlotte's Web, and Maurice Sendak, who gave the world Where the Wild Things Are. But as innovative as Ursula Nordstrom went on to become, in 1942, she believed Mrs. Brewster and that butcher knife were pushing the envelope in content for young adult readers. Now, obviously, Laura Ingalls Wilder prevailed. The scene remained. But it's significant, I think, that in the first edition of these Happy Golden Years, illustrated by Helen Sewell and Mildred Boyle, this edition does not include an illustration of the scene. An image of Mrs. Brewster combined with Wilder's narrative would have given too much emphasis and been too dark and disturbing for young adults in 1943, at least from the publisher's point of view. This illustration dates from 1953, when Wilder's publisher issued a new edition of Wilder's books, illustrated by Englishman Garth Williams. 10 years after the book's publication, young readers themselves had convinced publishers like Harper & Brothers that darker, grittier content had its place in young adult literature. Still, I think it's important to note that children's and young adult literature in the 1930s and 1940s, when Wilder wrote the Little House novels, was much more conservative than it is today. Such topics as divorce, sexuality, alcoholism, child abuse, these issues became accepted topics in children's literature much later through the groundbreaking work of S.E. Hinton, Robert Cormier, Judy Blume, and Francesca Lea Bloch in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Even Mary's blindness in the Little House books was a somewhat controversial topic for children's literature from the Depression era. Wilder's daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, edited her mother's manuscripts, including the final drafts of Pioneer Girl, and she initially discouraged her mother from including Mary's blindness in the Little House books. Wilder, however, maintained that a touch of tragedy makes the story truer to life, and showing the way we took it illustrates the spirit of the time and the frontier. In fact, the fictional Laura Ingalls aged in the series. Wilder fought to keep more and more scenes and episodes in the books over her daughter's objections that the material was becoming too adult. Lane apparently believed that a teenage main character had no place in books for young readers in the 1930s and 1940s. She even suggested that Wilder switch main characters from Laura to Carrie to avoid adult themes and ideas in the final Little House books. Again, Wilder disagreed. I don't see how we can spare what you call adult stuff, for that makes the story. It was there and Laura knew and understood it. We can't spoil the story by making it childish. Clearly, by the literary standards of the 1930s and 1940s, Wilder didn't whitewash her fiction for young readers. She didn't sanitize the story for them by writing tough, sometimes dark, scenes that dealt with dysfunctional families, disease, and mythic struggles on the frontier. She was blazing a new trail in children's and young adult fiction in the 1930s and 1940s. In fact, Wilder's greatest artistic achievement, The Long Winter, is extraordinarily dark and focuses on the fictional family's struggle with starvation, cold, and isolation. It was very adult stuff for young readers in the 1940s when it was published, and it remains dark material today. The book's original title was The Hard Winter, but Wilder's publisher, Ursula Nordstrom, feared the title would discourage and perhaps even frighten young readers away from reading it. So, with great regret, Wilder and even her daughter Rose Wilder Lane accepted the change. So, clearly, the conventions of children's and young adult literature were far more restrictive then than they are today. In fact, you could even say that the category of young adult literature wasn't officially recognized until 1958, when the American Library Association first began using the term young adult. Wilder herself had died the year before in 1957, before the term gained wide acceptance. It is certainly true, however, that Wilder chose not to transfer all the experiences she had lived her life and all of the things that she wrote about in Pioneer Girl into her Little House series. She didn't, for example, write about the birth and death of her baby brother, Charles Frederick, Freddie, as the family called him. He lived only 9 months, and after a short illness, one awful day, he straightened out his little body and was dead. And Wilder chose not to write about the family's decision to move east to Burr Oak, Iowa, after the grasshopper plague in Minnesota had wiped the family out financially. Charles and Caroline Ingalls briefly managed a hotel there, an enterprise that ultimately failed, and they returned to Minnesota, where the family lived in town, not on a farm. Why didn't Wilder write about these experiences in her Little House books? She wrote her daughter that it is a story in itself, but it does not belong in the picture I am making of the fictional family. In other words, these episodes didn't serve Wilder's larger themes, a frontier family moving west, pursuing agrarian values, finding land in the West, and building a new life for themselves there. It wasn't that the material was too adult. Her resistance to include this material from Pioneer Girl was primarily thematic. Now, still, there is no question that Pioneer Girl contains grittier, more adult material than the Little House books. In the first place, Wilder wrote Pioneer Girl for adult readers, not for children. This was, after all, her memoir, her personal account of her childhood and adolescence, written from an adult perspective for adult readers. Wilder hoped to sell Pioneer Girl to a prominent national magazine of the period, the Saturday Evening Post or the Ladies' Home Journal. In those days, national magazines were a significant market for longer-form nonfiction like Pioneer Girl, as well as for short and long-form fiction. Magazines serialized longer manuscripts. A memoir like Pioneer Girl might appear in 3 or 4 subsequent issues of the Ladies' Home Journal or the Saturday Evening Post. And when longer works of fiction and nonfiction were popular with magazine readers, writers could then negotiate a separate book deal. In essence, they could sell their manuscripts twice, something that was especially appealing to both Wilder and Lane during the dark days of the Depression. Wilder finished writing Pioneer Girl in 1930, a full 2 years before her Little House books were published. I'm not going to describe the marketing effort Lane launched to sell her mother's manuscript. You can read about that in the book. But I will say that Wilder chose to write about people, places, and memories that were not only important to her personally, but that would resonate with adult readers in the 1930s. So, as reviewers and reporters have pointed out, Pioneer Girl does indeed contain stark scenes of domestic abuse, love triangles gone awry, and a man who lit himself on fire while drunk on whiskey. All of that is there. That is because adult material was appropriate for adult readers in the 1930s. But Wilder, probably on Lane's advice, apparently felt that some material was inappropriate even for adult readers. In the rough draft version of Pioneer Girl, Wilder includes an especially troubling scene. She and her family are living in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, and once again they're struggling to make ends meet. A prosperous family has persuaded Ma to let Laura live in the home of their son and daughter-in-law, Will and Nanny Masters. Nanny suffered from mysterious fainting spells. She couldn't adequately care for their little girl, and Laura's work was to look out for both the mother and the daughter. So as for Will Masters, Wilder was uncomfortable around him. She writes, "I did not like either to be where Will was. He was drinking more than ever. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he had such a silly look on his face. I hadn't stayed with Nanny very long when one night I waked from a sound sleep to find Will leaning over me. I could smell the whiskey on his breath. I woke up quickly. 'Is Nanny sick?' I asked. 'No,' he answered. 'Lie down and be still.' 'Go away quick,' I said, 'or I will scream for Nanny.' He went, and the next day Ma said I could come home." Now, a lot is implied in this scene. There's not a lot of description here, but the implication is clear. Laura was threatened with sexual assault. The situation ends well for her, and yet this episode was cut from the edited versions of Pioneer Girl. The material was too dark, too gritty, too sexually charged for even adult readers in the Depression. Wilder's literary agent didn't even see this scene. So now that we've cleared the air about all the adult material in Pioneer Girl, why is the manuscript important? What did I hope reporters and reviewers would see in Wilder's autobiography? In other words, why does Pioneer Girl matter? What does it reveal about Laura Ingalls Wilder and her work? 1, it gives readers new insights into Wilder's childhood and adolescence. Regardless of the grittier, darker elements in Pioneer Girl, Wilder's memoir provides us with more perspective and information about her life in her own voice. As I mentioned earlier, we get a glimpse into the birth of her baby brother. Coming home from school one day, we found a strange woman getting supper and a little brother beside Ma in the bed. We were very proud of him and always hurried home from school to see him. He was born November 1st, 1875. His full name was Charles Frederick. As I mentioned earlier, 9 months later, as the Ingalls family left Minnesota and moved east, their farm and finances in ruin, Freddie took ill. Little brother was not well, and the doctor came. I thought that would cure him. But little brother got worse instead of better, and one awful day, he straightened out his little body and was dead. Yet, in the midst of grief, despair, and economic struggle, Wilder gives us a scene just a few days later when the Ingalls family is living in rooms over a grocery store in Burr Oak, Iowa. We liked our reading lessons very much and used to practice reading them aloud at home nights. Pa knew, but did not tell us until later, that a crowd used to gather in the store beneath to hear us read. This is one of my favorite images in Pioneer Girl. Laura and Mary reading aloud from the Pied Piper, Paul Revere's Ride, The Village Blacksmith, all taken from the Independent Fifth Reader as townspeople gather below to hear them read. I think that's just a really sweet scene. A second reason why Pioneer Girl is important. It illustrates Wilder's natural and instinctive talent as both a writer and as a storyteller. The question of Wilder's skill and ability as a writer came into question in large part with the publication of this book back in 1993, The Ghost in the Little House by William Holtz, a biography of Wilder's daughter, Rose Wilder Lane. Now, I'm simplifying the book's major premise only slightly when I say that it contended that Laura Ingalls Wilder had virtually no talent and that Rose Wilder Lane had ghost-written the Little House books. Holtz devoted very little attention to Pioneer Girl, which perhaps explains why his depiction of Wilder's talent didn't focus on passages from her original manuscript that are lyrical, arresting, and clearly reveal her raw talent, passages like this one. The sun sank lower and lower until, looking like a ball of pulsing liquid light, it sank gloriously in clouds of crimson and silver. Cold purple shadows rose in the east, crept slowly around the horizon, then gathered above in depth on depth of darkness, from which the stars swung low and bright. Now, I want to emphasize this is rough draft, unedited Laura Ingalls Wilder. This is how the passage appears in her own handwriting on that big chief tablet on which she wrote Pioneer Girl. Now, one isolated passage from a long manuscript doesn't necessarily translate to sustained talent, and yet this passage from Pioneer Girl is important. It showcases Wilder's descriptive powers, which Rose Wilder Lane herself admired and praised. I don't see how anybody could improve on your use of words. You are perfect in describing landscapes and things. But this particular descriptive passage from the original rough draft of Pioneer Girl also illustrates what sometimes happens when editors, in this case Rose Wilder Lane, convince writers to revise and change something that should never have been altered. Here's how the opening sentence from this passage appears in the final adult edited version of Pioneer Girl. The sun sank lower and lower still, a ball of pulsing liquid light. It sank in clouds of crimson and silver. Now, granted, this edit isn't very radical, yet the passage loses its original poetic rhythm and grace. But Wilder's original passage in Pioneer Girl went on to have yet another life, this time in her novel By the Shores of Silver Lake. Here's how it appears in this book. The sun sank, a ball of pulsing liquid light. It sank in clouds of crimson and silver. Again, the edit is very, very subtle, but it again lacks the original's natural rhythm and grace. And except for the opening lines you see here, Wilder decided that what she had written all those years ago in Pioneer Girl was pretty good. So the rest of the passage, as it appears in By the Shores of Silver Lake, is identical to the rough draft version from Pioneer Girl. Now, let's take one more look at Wilder's original opening line and that description from Pioneer Girl. The sun sank lower and lower until, looking like a ball of pulsing liquid light, it sank gloriously in clouds of crimson and silver. This original line has movement, both in the scene it describes and in the rhythm of its words. Furthermore, and this is kind of a technical issue for all you writing geeks out there, Wilder uses an adverb in this sentence. She uses the word gloriously. Usually adverbs are not a writer's friend, but here Wilder uses it brilliantly. But this passage had yet one more life, this time in Rose Wilder Lane's pioneer novel, Freeland. Now, this book borrows heavily from Pioneer Girl. It was published in 1938. And here is Rose Wilder Lane's take on Wilder's original passage. Sunset spread in rainbow colors around the level rim of the earth, and purple shadows rose. The low stars were huge and quivering. Now, frankly, this passage is pretty flat and dull. It lacks the visual immediacy and impact of her mother's rough draft original version. It has no lyricism, it has no grace. If Lane truly had been the ghostwriter of the Little House books, why do her pioneer novels lack the lyricism, beauty, and distinctive voice readers find in many passages in Pioneer Girl and throughout the Little House books themselves? Now, point 3, why Pioneer Girl matters. Pioneer Girl reveals Wilder's growth as a writer, her transformation from a newspaper columnist to a memoirist to a novelist. Laura Ingalls Wilder launched her professional writing career in 1911, first as a columnist and then as a page editor for the Missouri Ruralist Agricultural newspaper, the largest farm publication in Missouri in the early 20th century. Wilder's work for the Ruralist was very, very successful, so successful that the Ruralist published a profile on her in 1918. Here's what the editor of the Missouri Ruralist had to say about Laura Ingalls Wilder. She knows farm folks and their problems as few women who write know them. And having sympathy with the folks whom she serves, she writes well. In Pioneer Girl, readers can see that Wilder, at least initially, wrote like a newspaper columnist. Episodes are short, intense, every word matters, because newspaper columnists, unlike memoirists or novelists, have to make every word count. They don't have a lot of real estate. They don't have a lot of physical space on the page in which to develop their stories. Here's what I mean. Let's take a look at the opening of Pioneer Girl. Once upon a time, years and years ago, Pa stopped the horses in the wagon they were hauling away out on the prairie in Indian Territory. "Well, Caroline," he said, "here's the place we've been looking for. Might as well camp." So Pa and Ma got down from the wagon. Pa unhitched the horses and picketed them, tied them to long ropes fastened to wooden pegs driven in the ground so they could eat the grass. Then he made the campfire out of bits of willow twigs from the creek nearby. Ma cooked supper over the fire, and after we had eaten, Sister Mary and I were put to bed in the wagon, and Pa and Ma sat a while by the fire. Pa would bring the horses and tie them to the wagon before he and Ma came to sleep in the wagon too. I lay and looked through the opening in the wagon cover at the campfire and Pa and Ma sitting there. It was lonesome and so still, with the stars shining down on the great flat land where no one lived. There was a long, scared sound off in the night, and Pa said it was a wolf howling. It frightened me a little, but we were safe in the wagon with its nice tight cover to keep out the wind and the rain. The wagon was home. We had lived in it so long, and Pa's rifle was hanging at the side where he could get it quickly to shoot the wolf. He wouldn't let wolves nor anything hurt us. And Jack, the brindle bulldog, was lying under the wagon, guarding us too. And so we fell asleep. This opening passage reads like a newspaper column. It tells a single story effectively while using a minimum number of words and a minimum amount of space. But as Wilder's confidence grew, she began to understand that a memoirist didn't need to restrict herself to a tight word count for every scene and every narrative. So Pioneer Girl becomes more elaborate, more detailed as you get deeper and deeper into the memoir. Let's take a look at a later passage from Pioneer Girl when the first wave of grasshoppers descends on the Ingalls family farm at Plum Creek. The weather was just right and the crops grew and grew. At dinner one day, Pa was telling us that the wheat in our field was so tall it would just stand under his arms with long, beautiful heads and filling nicely. He said the grain was all soft and milky yet, but was so well grown he felt sure we would have a wonderful crop. Just then we heard someone call, and Mrs. Nelson was in the doorway. She was all out of breath and running, wringing her hands and almost crying. "The grasshoppers are coming, the grasshoppers are coming," she shrieked. "Come and look." We all ran to the door and looked around. Now and then a grasshopper dropped on the ground, but we couldn't see anything to be excited about. "Look at the sun, just look at the sun," cried Mrs. Nelson, pointing to the sky. We raised our faces and looked straight into the sun. It had been shining brightly, but now there was a light-colored, fleecy cloud over its face, so it did not hurt our eyes. And then we saw that the cloud was grasshoppers, their wings a shiny white, making a screen between us and the sun. They were dropping to the ground like hail in a hailstorm, faster and faster. This is just the beginning of the scene. It continues for several more pages. But notice Wilder's use of language here, her colorful and vivid descriptions. We raised our faces straight into the sun, a light-colored, fleecy cloud. The phrasing is memorable too. The grasshoppers hit the ground like hail in a hailstorm, faster and faster. And perhaps because of her experience as a newspaper columnist, she intersperses description with dialogue that is believable. It sounds the way real people talk. Wilder combines all of these elements here to write a longer, multi-page episode. She's writing long-form nonfiction here, not a tightly constructed newspaper column. On the other hand, Pioneer Girl does show us just how much Wilder grew as a novelist once she understood the freedom that writing fiction could give her. Here, for example, is a single sentence from Pioneer Girl. Pa built a house of logs from the trees in the nearby creek bottom, and when we moved into it, there was a hole in the wall where the window was to be, and a quilt hung over the doorway to keep the weather out. In Little House on the Prairie, Wilder's third novel, she devoted an entire chapter to the construction of that log house that Pa built, and then another chapter to moving in, plus a chapter on two stout doors, and chapters on the construction of the fireplace, building the roof, and moving into the house. From one sentence in Pioneer Girl, with the confidence of a novelist, Wilder wrote 5 chapters about that little house in her third novel. From one sentence, 5 chapters. Which brings me to yet another reason why Pioneer Girl is important. It served as the foundation for Wilder's Little House books. Wilder and Lane apparently abandoned any attempt to publish Pioneer Girl as a memoir in 1933 when their literary agent entered it in the Atlantic Monthly Little Brown Writing Contest. Pioneer Girl, by the way, did not win that year. And yet, Wilder went on to use the manuscript as an outline for the rest of the Little House series. She drew heavily on passages, scenes, descriptions, and characters from Pioneer Girl. They often found their way into the Little House books. When Rose Wilder Lane moved to Columbia, Missouri in the mid-1930s to research a book of her own, she took Pioneer Girl with her, and Wilder requested the return of sections of the manuscript as she worked on By the Shores of Silver Lake, her 5th novel. As she wrote in 1937, "Thank you for the pages from Pioneer Girl, they will help." Now, Wilder even borrowed an episode from Pioneer Girl for this book, Farmer Boy, her novel about her husband's childhood in Malone, New York. In Pioneer Girl, Wilder recounts the story of a young schoolmaster, William H. Reed. He was a slim young man who inherited a schoolhouse of big, unruly boys who had started fights with the previous teachers and driven all of the previous teachers away. The leader of the gang was a big bad boy named Mose, who, according to Wilder, was the worst of the lot. Mr. Reed sat in his chair by his desk with his ruler in one hand, idly spatting it against the other. It was a large, flat, very strong ruler he had just made. Mose was the last one in. He was all ready to fight and came swaggering up, expecting Mr. Reed to stand up so he could knock him down. But Mr. Reed sat still, and just as Mose stood in front of him, reached up with his left hand, grabbed Mose by the collar and jerked, tripping him with his foot at the same time and laid him neatly across his knees. It all happened so quickly, and Mose was so surprised, but before he knew what had happened, he lay there like a bad little boy and was being soundly spanked with the flat, strong ruler. Mose is so humiliated, he doesn't return to school. Neither do the other big bad boys, and from that day forward, Mr. Reed runs an efficient and peaceful schoolhouse. In Farmer Boy, the teacher's name is Mr. Course, and he too is described as a slim, pale young man who isn't big enough to fight off the bad boys that Almanzo meets on his first day of school. They had come to thrash the teacher and break up the school. The leader of the gang in Farmer Boy is a young man called Bill Ritchie. Now, in the fictional version of the story, the slim, pale, but competent school teacher faces Bill down with a black snake ox whip 15 feet long. The thin, long lash coiled around Bill's legs, and Mr. Course jerked. Bill lurched and almost fell. Quick as black lightning, the lash circled and struck and coiled again and again. Now, the image of the whip is far more dramatic than the ruler in Pioneer Girl, but the outcome is the same. The big boys were licked. Mr. Course had licked Bill Ritchie's gang. And in the process, an episode from Pioneer Girl found its way into a novel about young Almanzo Wilder. Rose Wilder Lane also used material from Pioneer Girl in several short stories, including some published in the Ladies' Home Journal, the Saturday Evening Post, and then collected in a novel called Old Hometown. And then, of course, there were Rose Wilder Lane's two novels based on Pioneer Girl, Let the Hurricane Roar and Free Land. While her mother wrote about Big Jerry and By the Shores of Silver Lake, Lane wrote about half-breed Jack in Free Land. And Lane's main characters in Let the Hurricane Roar are named Charles and Caroline. He played the fiddle, and she was a quiet person. Her face was quiet under smooth wings of hair, and all her movements were gentle and deft. Lane's main characters in this book took their personalities as well as their names from Pioneer Girl. So, Pioneer Girl is indeed a somewhat grittier, somewhat edgier account of Laura Ingalls Wilder's childhood and adolescence, but for good reason. And it's an important addition to Laura Ingalls Wilder's literary legacy. It gives us new insight into her growth and development as a novelist and as the literary legend she has since become. Pioneer Girl is also, as one reviewer aptly described it, a treasure. I think I have time for some questions. Yes?
I know it's been floated for quite a while about Pioneer Girl. How did it come about that it was printed at this time?
That's a good question. There have been a couple of attempts to get Pioneer Girl into print. I wrote a biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder in 2007. It was published in 2007. And while I was doing my research at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library for that book, I was in the archive room and the telephone rang. And the archive room is very small there. It's not nearly as large as the archive area you have here. It's very small, and the archivist was sitting just a few feet away from me, so I heard the phone call. And I could tell that he was talking to someone about Pioneer Girl, and he was describing how the caller could get copies and the different versions that they had. And when he hung up, I said, "Oh, is that another Wilder scholar?" And he said, "No, that's a fan." And he said, we get dozens and dozens of these calls at the Hoover every year. And then when my biography came out, I started hearing from readers who said, "Where did you get a copy of Pioneer Girl, and how can I get one?" And so the thought kind of stayed with me, and a couple of years later, I called my editor and I said, "I have this idea for a really obscure book, but I'm wondering if we could do an annotated version of Pioneer Girl that would explain all the different versions and how the versions interacted with the Little House books themselves." And I thought my editor would scratch her head and say, "Oh, I'll get back to you on this." Instead, she said, "Oh, let's do this." And so she said, "You write a proposal, I'll deal with the financial side, and we'll approach the executors of Wilder's estate." And much to my surprise, they said yes, almost right away. They liked the idea of an annotated version that put the manuscript into context, and they wanted to work with me and with the South Dakota State Historical Society Press because they had liked the biography. So I think it was just the right kind of idea at the right time. Yes?
I think all of us read these books, and we were wondering, how does Laura remember what she did as a child? But this is mostly fiction now.
Well, she turned the Little House books into fiction. There's no doubt about that.
There's no way you can remember, how you made the bed one morning.
But I will say this about her. Pioneer Girl is a memoir, and so it is nonfiction. She wrote it when she was 63. With the exception of maybe 4 or 5 people in Pioneer Girl, I found a historical record for everyone she mentions in that book, which I think is absolutely astounding. I think Laura Ingalls Wilder was blessed with a really good memory. I think also that she was one of those writers who never forgot what it was like to be a child or a teenager. I think Rose Wilder Lane had more trouble with that. And there are letters going back between Rose and Laura about how to deal with an adolescent Laura in the books. And it's pretty clear that Laura Ingalls Wilder remembered the feelings that she had had as a child or as a teenager. And I think that helped her too when she jumped from nonfiction to fiction. So what she really was writing in the Little House books is autobiographical fiction. But many of the episodes and incidents, and certainly the characters themselves, were really based on fact. Yes?
The first I heard of this book was when I saw it in the Wall Street Journal in the bestseller list. Was the literary world surprised that it became a bestseller?
I was surprised that it became a bestseller, and my publisher was surprised that it became a bestseller. I thought it would be a very obscure academic book that only a very few passionate Wilder fans would read. I underestimated the number of passionate Wilder fans there are in the world. And we got a glimpse that things were going to be kind of crazy in the summer before the book was published, not only because of all the media attention we were getting, but because I was getting ready to teach a massive open online course through Missouri State University. Those are free online non-academic classes. And I was down there, I just finished taping my last lecture, and my teaching assistant had just put out an announcement about the class and that the class was going to start in a few weeks. And she came into the conference room where I was sitting, and she was white as a ghost. And she had only posted the announcement about the class for about 30 minutes, and already 3,000 people had signed up. And by the time the dust settled, I taught 2 classes on Wilder, and it reached 8,500 people. So we began to see, and I called my publisher and I said, you know, something weird is happening. And so she decided to up the initial press run from 10,000 to 15,000 copies. We're now in the 9th printing of the book. And the most recent number I have from her on sales is 140,000 copies. So I thought 5,000 or 6,000 copies, and you know, it did much better than any of us thought it would. But I think that people were craving more information about her, and I think it was the right book at the right time. I'm very grateful to Laura Ingalls Wilder's Ghost. Yes?
2 comments. About her being younger and remembering things like the quilt that they had. They could tell stories. Oh, this was so-and-so's dress that they wore to this. And she could hear those stories again and again and again, where she might not remember what she did at the big house, the little house in the woods. She would remember the story then. And I also thought that maybe she got some of her colorful way of telling things is through Mary. If you read it, she would, what does it look like, Laura? What's it look like? And she would try to make it alive again for Mary. So that might have given her some early, to talk the way, to write the way she talked.
I think that's a really good point. I don't know if all of you heard this, but it certainly was true that Laura became her sister's eyes. And so that she learned how to describe things in a very vivid and concrete way, which is what all good storytellers do. But I also think that Laura Ingalls Wilder had grown up listening to her father tell stories. And so she kind of inherited that natural storytelling ability from her father. And she actually told reporters and reviewers after the publication of her first book, for example, Little House in the Big Woods, that one of the reasons she wrote that book was she wanted to put her story, her father's stories, down on paper and share them with the world. So I think he certainly influenced her ability as a storyteller as well. Very good point, thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, back in the back.
Was Rose her only child, and what can you tell us about Laura Ingalls Wilder, her relationship with her daughter? What kind of, if she was her only child, anything about her daughter's life? What kind of a person she grew up to be?
Well, we could spend the whole evening talking about Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose Wilder Lane and their relationship. I will say that it was complicated, as all mother-daughter relationships usually are. But I will say that Rose Wilder Lane, a lot of people have forgotten this about her, was a very successful writer in her own right, and she was something of a literary celebrity in the late 1920s and early 30s when Laura Ingalls Wilder launched the Little House series. In fact, Rose Wilder Lane helped her mother find a literary agent and put her mother in touch with publishing contacts in New York. But Rose Wilder Lane and Laura Ingalls Wilder launched their professional writing careers at about the same time. Laura Ingalls Wilder started writing for The Ruralist in 1911. Just a few years earlier, Rose Wilder Lane left the Missouri Ozarks. She went to work in Kansas City as a freelancer for a couple of Kansas City newspapers, and then from there she moved to San Francisco and became a contributing writer to the San Francisco Bulletin. And very quickly, Rose moved on to bigger markets. She was writing for some of the more prestigious magazines of the day, including Sunset Magazine. And during the 20s, she wrote fiction and nonfiction, so she was very, very well known. I think what's interesting is she's now read primarily for two reasons. She's read first because she was Laura Ingalls Wilder's daughter, and Freeland and Let the Hurricane Roar, which now has a new title. It's called Young Pioneers. And if you pick up Young Pioneers, by the way, the publisher changed the main characters' names to Molly and David, so you don't see the parallels so clearly between the two books. But we read her because she was Wilder's daughter, and the two books that she's best known for were based on her mother's stories and came directly out of Pioneer Girl. The other reason that Rose Wilder Lane is still read today is because many people consider her the grandmother of the Libertarian Party. And in the late 1930s and early 1940s, she essentially stopped writing fiction and began to become more of a political writer. And Laura and El Manzo did have one other child, a baby boy, and he died shortly after he was born. Other questions? Yes?
Did Carrie Ingalls or Grace ever have children?
Neither Carrie nor Grace had children. Grace, both of them married. Carrie had an interesting career. We kind of tend to think of her as being this frail little girl. She actually homesteaded in western Dakota Territory, South Dakota. And she went on to have a career as a newspaper publisher. She learned how to set type, and she moved out to the Black Hills and had a very interesting life there. She married in her 30s. She married a widower, and she helped him raise his children, but they had no children of their own. Yes?
Who controls the estates now of Laura and Rose?
The literary estate is controlled by the Little House Heritage Trust. Rose married, but she miscarried her only child. He was born at 6 months. He was born premature. In Salt Lake. And this is what's interesting. Information about her infant son is relatively new. It's come out in the last year and a half. And the fact that the child was born in Salt Lake City surprised everyone. No one really knew that she was there. But anyway, to make a long story short, she throughout her life took young men under her wing. Perhaps she was looking for that infant son that she lost. And Roger McBride became her kind of adopted grandson. That's how she thought of him. He came from a distinguished publishing family. His father was connected with Reader's Digest. And Roger McBride went on to become a lawyer and eventually the literary agent for Rose and the literary executor for both Rose and Wilder's estates. And at his death, it went into the Little House Heritage Trust. Okay, yes?
How do you pronounce her name? It sounded to me like, is it Laura or Laura, or do we not know?
I pronounce it Laura. Yeah. And most of the people around Mansfield, Missouri who knew and there's still some old timers there who knew, they call her Mrs. Wilder there, who knew Mrs. Wilder call her Laura. And I think there's one recording of Laura Ingalls Wilder where she refers to her husband and she calls him El Manzo. not Almanzo. Any other questions? Oh, okay, maybe one more.
There are 2 libraries that have rooms dedicated to Laura, one in Detroit and one in Southern California. Have you been to those?
I haven't been to them, but they have manuscripts. And Laura Ingalls Wilder was really delighted when she was invited to speak at the Detroit Book Fair. And she was so delighted that that's why they have a couple of her manuscripts there. Most of the manuscripts are in Mansfield, Missouri at Rocky Ridge Farm. And for those of you who are Wilder fans, I really recommend visiting Rocky Ridge Farm because they have a lot of Wilder material there. And they're getting ready to dedicate a new museum. The new museum just opened, I think, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and the dedication is in 2 weeks. The other place, all the Wilder sites are really worth visiting. But the other site that has a great deal of Ingalls family material and a certain amount of Wilder material too is, of course, DeSmet, South Dakota, where Charles and Caroline settled. And the other big cache of Wilder papers is at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa. And that's also worth visiting. So. All right, thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Thank you. Hi. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. My name's Melanie. Oh, thanks. Well, it's been wonderful. I mean, so happy. You grew up reading Wilder and still wrestling about it. She actually writes about her childhood. Oh, good. And now you'll see the museum. Well, thank you so much. Have fun in Missouri. Next. Hi. Oh, thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thanks to the management and staff of the Hudson Library and Historical Society for their assistance in the production of this program and for providing the 2016 Adult Author Series for the citizens of Hudson. For a DVD or Blu-ray copy of this or any HCTV program, contact Hudson Cable Television at 330-653-2500 or via email at hctv@hudson.oh.us.